Who runs this place? It's the question any reporter worth their salt ought to ask when they pitch up somewhere. But supposing this reporter was to be deposited in Britain, if he or she picked up the newspapers, they might well conclude that the introduction of universally free education in the 1940s hadn't changed much. On the eve of local elections, David Cameron is having to fight accusations that his government is some sort of make-work scheme for the products of Eton. Although it's not entirely true that Methuselah was an Etonian, the argument has been around for a good while. It's 50 years, for example, since a senior Tory talked about a magic circle of Etonians making and unmaking prime ministers. David Grossman reports.
Campaigning in the local elections, the Prime Minister is keen to show how in touch he is with regular folk. See, for example, how he eats cheese. But increasingly, he's having to answer the charge that he and his inner circle are somewhat a breed apart, that what he leads is not so much a government as a chumocracy.
Well, I appoint people because they're good enough to do the job and they're the right person for that job. And I have people around me who have all sorts of different backgrounds and all sorts of different schooling. But the most important thing is, are you going to be good enough to do the job?
So who is this supposedly cosy group of chums? Well, the latest name in the frame is Christopher Lockwood. He's just been appointed as the latest member of David Cameron's policy unit. Now, Mr. Lockwood is a pal of the PM's. They holidayed in Tuscany together, apparently. He's also a pal of Chancellor George Osborne's, an old school friend, in fact, from the elite St Paul's Public School. Another recent appointee is Joe Johnson. Now, he's the brother of Boris Johnson, and both men, of course, attended Eton at the same time as David Cameron. Coincidentally, so did David Cameron's Chief of Staff, Ed Llewellyn. And yet another appointee, Jessie Norman, also went to Eton. This may be all leaving Conservative Party chairman Andrew Feldman feeling a little bit left out because, well, he only knows the Prime Minister from their days at Oxford together. It doesn't leave much room for women who, of course, don't get to go to Eton. But does this really matter if this pool of talent is from a small source?
I think this whole thing about the chumocracy really has two negative effects. First of all, there's the obvious one that people look at the Prime Minister's operation and think it's completely staffed by his friends, people from very good private schools. So there is the perception problem. But I think the deeper problem is that actually it means that you have a Downing Street operation which has such a narrow experience of the country that it doesn't produce such good policy. It isn't so effective politically at understanding the country. And it's that second problem that I think is the bigger one.
And what about Labour? Well, they have their own inner circle in the shape of some of the trades unions. Billy Hayes leads the Communication Workers Union, which has donated money to the office of the Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls. Paul Kenny leads the GMB union, which gives money to the Shadow Business Secretary Chuka Umuna's office. And as for Ed Miliband, well, the unions have queued up to support him since the last general election. His office has received money from both the GMB and the most powerful union of all, Unite, led by Len McCluskey. Of course, we should remember that the trades union movement founded the Labour Party in the first place, but even so, the Electoral Commission's data suggests that they have given more generously in the past 2 years and given a greater percentage of total donations to the party. However, one former trade union official says all unions are not equal, that the Unite union has become dominant in Labour politics.
Obviously, Unite are very influential in terms of the money they give. But it goes much wider than that. Unite have now got a total political strategy, if you like. It's not just about tweaking the purse strings. They're training up their candidates, they're developing independent policy, they're running independent campaigns, they're establishing an independent industrial strategy outside of the TUC. So in a sense, they're not simply saying your money or your life, they're basically establishing an entirely independent labour movement, if you like.
And what about those other centres of power outside Westminster, the European Union, for example? These are some of their big players. You probably don't recognise all that many of them. Estimates on the extent of EU influence on the UK vary wildly, but the House of Commons Library has calculated that between 1997 and 2009, only 6.8% of primary legislation, that's Acts of Parliament, and 14.1% of secondary legislation, those are the regulations that implement law, came from the EU.
Clearly, European regulations have an effect. Devolution certainly has a big effect in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Less of an impact in England, apart from those areas which they have elected mayors. But even despite all that, we're still a pretty centralised society. There's still a lot a Prime Minister with the proper backing and organisation and will can do.
It was in 1440 that Henry VI founded Eton College.
So maybe it is significant that so many in British public life come from such a narrow circle, but whether voters care, whether it will make the slightest bit of difference to tomorrow's elections in England and Wales, well, that's another question.
Well, now to talk about this, we have Sarah Wollaston, who's a Conservative MP, who's questioned the number of old Etonians in government. She joins us from Exeter, where the sun is apparently still shining. Dr. Anthony Seldon is a political historian and the Master of Wellington College. Harry Mount is a journalist and an author, a product of the public school system, and David Cameron's cousin, apparently. And Tony Pearce is the newly elected president of the National Union of Students. When she takes up her post in the summer, she'll become the first leader in the organisation's history who hasn't been to university. Anthony Seldon, what do you think this looks like, this appointments policy?
Well, I think it doesn't look very good, does it? Because this is not just from one sector of education, the public schools, it's from one particular school, and we've been a democracy for getting on for 2 centuries, and so it's bound to provoke all kinds of questions about exactly how fair is Britain today.
What do you think, Harry?
It doesn't look great, and they certainly are an elite, but what they really are is an intellectual elite. For what it's worth, Joe Johnson got a first from Balliol, Jesse Norman has just written an intellectual biography of Edmund Burke, Chris Lockwood got a starred first. And I'm just going through these achievements, even though I do know some of them, not just because they're friends, but actually the more important thing is that they're intellectual as opposed to that they've been to a certain school or a certain university.
They're all men, of course, Sarah Wollaston. What does it feel like to you?
Well, as other commentators have said, it's about the appearance that it gives. It's not just the message we give, it's the messenger that delivers it that's important, and about being much more inclusive.
Go on.
And I think also it says something about patronage. I think this is the heart of this, as we were also hearing about the problem within the Labour Party. And if you take, for example, when David Miliband left for New York, Ed commented that if I am Prime Minister, I'll make sure one way or another that he serves this country. Well, what's that if it's not patronage? So I think for me it's about how we tackle the way patronage operates throughout the entire system at Westminster.
And Tony Pearce, you look at it from a different generation and a different background. What does it look like to you?
I think it has a huge impact on the way that people in this country see politics and their view of politics. And actually this idea that politics is some sort of elite club where only men who went to a certain school or university together can get in and lead the country, I think it's really concerning, actually. And it says a lot about the way, you know, that this government are running the country, I think. And actually, but that's kind of symptomatic of a wider problem in our political system.
And not exclusive to the Conservative Party.
Absolutely not.
Because the Labour Party also...
yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, this idea that it's full of different clubs of different types of people who give jobs to people that they grew up with or are friends with. And I take your point that, you know, these people, I completely take your point that they're intellectual elites, but actually you get to be an intellectual elite a certain way, and you also get that through a lot of privilege. And going somewhere like Eton, I'd argue, probably allows you to become an intellectual elite in the way that probably going to other places you get less of that opportunity.
Yeah, that's certainly true, yeah. You know, that's certainly true. And what is extremely unfair is the school system in this country, that the independent schools are some of the best schools in the world and the state schools are some of the worst schools in Europe. So you will end up with
all state schools. Some state schools.
No, but on the figures.
And some private sector schools are very, very good.
Yes, but there is a reason why you end up with this very skewed result of having the country run by public school boys, which it is because those public schools are extremely good at teaching.
OK, I mean, there are some fantastic state schools in Britain
of course there are.
Achieving not just great results, but also doing some of what the public schools do so well, which is to teach character and attitude and determination to make a mark,
yeah,
to make
yeah.
a change, as opposed to what, sadly, governments left and right have imposed on schools, which is to render them little more than exam factories, making the teachers and the students feel that the passing of exams is all that matters. Now, that's not why Etonians get to the top. It is because they have a confidence. They also have connections and everything that Tony was talking about, but it's more than just that.
But also, a bigger point here, I suppose, is that Eton teaches something else, which is boys. You know, they don't teach women, and actually, I don't take the point at all that, you know, only these people are by nature the most capable people in the country. They may well be, that could be complete coincidence, but I find it very hard to believe that the 6 most talented people in the country are men and they went to Eton. You know, it could be, but it would be a great coincidence.
Sarah Wilson, the interesting question, David Cameron is a highly intelligent man. If he knows, as he must know, what this looks like, why does he keep on doing it?
I do not know. I think it has to change because, of course, it could be so different. Today I met with the head of science and technology from a fantastic state community college in my constituency, and he was appointed by interview. Now, that's what the public would expect. Would government expect him to be appointed by patronage? I think we'd be outraged if that happened in the state sector. We wouldn't want surgeons appointed by patronage.
But there is another question here, which is, does it matter? I mean, is it damaging?
Well, look, if Joe Johnson turns out to be exactly what Cameron's looking for, if he gives the Conservative government a coherence that Cameron has rather lacked to date, then I think people will forget where he's come from. But if it is just more of the same, then I think it will really matter. But so, yes, it does matter. And I think that there should be perhaps more people, more of an open process. But I think we also have to remember that all leaders tend to, in China and Russia, tend to appoint people they know, because leaders are highly exposed, and you like to appoint either people you know and feel comfortable with and can trust, or who share the same kind of assumptions that you do.
And previous politicians over here have done exactly the same. And when Tony Blair appointed Charlie Faulkner, his old flatmate, there wasn't the same hoo-ha. Or in fact, Derry Irvine, the head of his old barristers' chambers. And it's because of our absolute obsession in this country with class. So the moment you appoint a 40-year-old who's been a former journalist on the FT, who's got a first from Oxford, no one would question that until suddenly you hear, ba-bam, he went to Eton. Therefore, it's appalling. We've got these sort of trigger words. We think somehow it's awful because of being associated with certain places. And that is a form of reverse snobbery, in fact.
I think that would be true if every other cabinet we'd ever seen wasn't made up of this kind of political elite. But I actually think that it is a problem when every time we see a cabinet formed, we see more men than women, when we see increasing numbers of people who went to private school, not just in the cabinet, but in wider politics, particularly at the highest levels across different political parties. And I do think it really does matter. You know, when people are more disenfranchised than ever with the political system, I think it bears huge importance. If we want people to participate in democracy and actually get involved in civil society, I think
it turns you off politics, does it?
I think it turns me off wanting to be involved in politics or thinking that I'm going to be kind of leading civil society, because I'm not a man. I didn't go to Eton. I've not been to university, and that's already that already kind of sets me apart from these people. But
there is no barrier actually holding back these people. I mean, one of the most powerful women of all time died a couple of weeks ago, and she wasn't held back by being a woman and not having gone to Eton. It's not as if there are these barriers being put up saying, oh no, you can't come have this job because you didn't go to Eton or because you didn't go to Oxford.
I'm not certain that is good enough in 2013. I'm much more with Tony. I think that we are a democracy. We have to not only be fairer, but be seen to be fairer to women, to all kinds of minority
setting up quotas?
groups.
Wouldn't that be crazy to say you must appoint a woman to this job just because she's a woman as opposed to she's brilliant?
I think that we have to do much more than we're doing at the moment. This country is not becoming more fair and more open to minority groups and to people from ordinary backgrounds. It's becoming, if anything, less. And this is worrying. And I think that schooling is absolutely fundamental. And we need to be doing more for our state schools, not just to teach them really well, which the government is trying to do, but to give them the kind of confidences that Tony has.
I completely agree, The unfairness is in the school system.
You can teach character, you can teach confidence, and I think we can also give these people more connections, more of a sense of a leg up, and then we can have a society that many people don't feel alienated from.
Sarah Wollaston, do you feel excluded?
No, I don't feel excluded, but the point is government works better without patronage. Look at what's happened to select committees. They're much more effective since we got rid of them being appointed by the whips, because they're more effective at challenging and holding government to account. And that's why it's so important that we get rid of patronage, because we'll all be better off for it. And let's face it, some of the best advice any of us ever get is from people who have a different worldview and who we don't agree with.
This point about class, this obsession we have with class, you're absolutely right. It is the mention of that magic word Eton that conjures up all sorts of illusions. Are we getting over that? No, we're not.
Well, I mean, Eton has just opened or is opening an academy. It's trying to reach out. It has lots of bursaries. I think many more public schools could follow Eton's lead, but many more other schools could follow the kind of confidence building and the sense almost of entitlement to have a good job.
But public schools generally, and Eton particularly, and people in this kind of elite, they're a million miles away from the majority of people who live in this country, and I think that's the real problem here, is that actually I don't want my government to feel a million miles away from my experiences and my lives. And I know that the people that I grew up with, where I grew up in the southwest, absolutely wouldn't want, their government to feel a million miles away. And yet they do, because there's no way they could kind of have...
Well, I don't disagree with you. I think something has to happen to make Britain a fairer and a more democratic country. Now, if these people, regardless of where they come from, can institute changes to achieve that and to get voter turnout and participation in politics and in civil society, which, after all, for goodness sake, is the closest they've ever had to an idea with their big society, if all this actually means something, then maybe, these people will have achieved something.
I'm not going to ask you what the fees are at your school.